Well, it's 10:59 here. We're going to just wait a couple more minutes. I see a lot of folks joining today. So we'll just wait one more minute and let, as I watch the numbers rise with our participants. Thanks everybody for joining our webinar today so we can talk about how to prioritize areas for wildlife highway mitigation across Colorado. All right, well, we've reached 60 participants, keeps going up, but I think we'll go ahead and get started so we can stay on time. We have a lot of interesting topics to talk with you all about. My name is Tabor Ward and I work with CDR Associates. We're a facilitation firm that facilitates the Colorado Wildlife and Transportation Alliance, a group that's been around since 2017. And we've been doing a lot of work in the past few years and wanted to share some of that with you all today. So just to remind you why you're here, we'll be talking about different types of tools that we've used to address Colorado wildlife vehicle collisions, in particular the West Slope Wildlife Prioritization Study and East Slope and Plains Wildlife Prioritization Study, and how we did those and how they're helping to mitigate conflict between wildlife and vehicles in Colorado. A couple logistical check-ins. Technology today. We're hoping that folks can use the chat function. If you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. We'll be monitoring the chat throughout. And at the end of the presentation, we'll be working with the panelists to answer any questions you have. So we'll be going through that after everybody presents. So please do ask your questions. We're excited to have some interactivity as a group and are really curious about the needs of our participants and what you're interested in as you're working on similar initiatives to decrease wildlife vehicle collisions. So welcome everybody. I'm going to introduce our first speaker, John Holst, and he works with the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership. Hi, John. If you'd like to share your slides with the group, I'm going to stop sharing. Welcome everybody.
Thanks, Tabor. Hi, everybody. My name is John Holst. I am the Colorado field representative for Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership. As Tabor mentioned, we're here today to talk about the West Slope Wildlife Prioritization Study. And what I'm going to do here real briefly is kind of give you an overview of the relationship between Colorado Parks and Wildlife, CPW, and the Colorado Department of Transportation. I have kind of a unique perspective on that relationship. Actually, before coming to work for TRCP this year, actually, I spent the previous 14 years working for CPW on energy and land use issues, including transportation. And previous to that, for 4 years, I actually worked for the Colorado Department of Transportation, CDOT, working on transportation and wildlife issues. So I have seen that relationship evolve over time, kind of from both sides of the table. And so early on, I would say mitigation efforts by both CPW and CDOT were really relatively sporadic across the state, focused on problem areas. And really the technology at the time was fairly limited. There was a fair amount of exclusionary fencing put up along problem areas, along with one-way gates like the one you see in the upper right-hand image there. That design with the kind of the tines was kind of state of the art at the time, but actually was not very effective. It really took only one large cow elk to move through one of those to permanently bend those tines in a way that they were essentially leaving a gap in the fence so that there was a more or less a hole in the fence where animals could move freely into the right of way and out of the right of way. I even, on one occasion, I even saw one of those gates where a bull elk or a large cow had gotten stuck in the tines and literally ripped the gate off its hinges. So just not a real effective technique. There were some historic successes. The arch culvert you see in the bottom right-hand image actually was installed in the 70s west of Durango. We don't really know much of the history of that structure. It may have been installed primarily as a cattle crossing, but it did include wildlife exclusionary fencing on both sides of the highway for some distance. And so in fact, it does function even today pretty successfully as a wildlife crossing structure. We've monitored that and it works pretty well. There were some other historic successes in the 70s and 80s, but unfortunately, there were also some failures. There were a number of areas along I-70 where box culverts were installed, relatively small, for big game, like 8x10 type box culverts, along with wildlife exclusionary fencing. And CPW, to their credit, did do some research and monitoring of the efficacy of those structures. Unfortunately, as it turned out, because those structures and that mitigation wasn't designed really in a way that was going to make them successful, that monitoring resulted in essentially showing that those structures didn't work very well. I even had, I guess at one time, I talked to one of the biologists up there for CPW at that time, and he told me that after the fencing and box culverts went in on I-70, he lost something like 80% of his local mule deer population. So you can see how that documented lack of success kind of had a chilling effect on CPW's enthusiasm to advocate for more of that kind of mitigation at that time. To the point that when I was actually hired by the DOT in the early 2000s, there was really a lot of skepticism within CPW as to whether or not this type of mitigation would work, and some real resistance to actually advocating for it. So based on that, in the early 2000s, CDOT really led the charge on looking at habitat connectivity in Colorado. There was some pretty good language in a couple of the federal highway bills at that time that talked about connectivity, and CDOT took advantage of that. They did a number of corridor-specific looks at habitat connectivity, as well as some statewide looks, partnering with CSU on a couple of different research projects, and also partnering with nonprofit organizations like the Southern Rockies Ecosystem Project, who Julia Kinch led at that time, who you'll hear from a little later today. The image you see on the right there is actually from that study in 2008, and it really is just showing a modeled best wildlife crossing location for lynx based on GPS lynx telemetry locations. In addition to that, in the 2000s, at least on a couple corridors, CDOT was successful in getting wildlife crossing structures put into the plans for some of these corridor improvement projects, really based on how those corridor improvement projects would impact habitat connectivity. So really, again, it kind of led back to the language in some of the highway bills at that time and some of the federal highway guidance on maintaining habitat connectivity. That type of sort of mitigation incorporated into corridor projects was not really widespread in Colorado at the time, but it did at least happen on a couple occasions. And so these efforts by CDOT, I think, really culminated in 2011 when they began the design for the State Highway 9 mitigation project, which really has some state-of-the-art wildlife mitigation associated with it. That project was moved forward with really strong local support, as well as support from a private partner. And not to say that CPW, Colorado Parks and Wildlife, wasn't engaged in these projects. Actually, Michelle Cowerden, in particular for State Highway 9, was really involved and contributed significantly. In fact, CPW was really involved in all of these projects listed here, in addition to a few more, but they really weren't the lead. CDOT was really the driving force behind these projects. So what brought CPW back to the table? Well, there were really a couple of things. The first one I would say is, well, CPW kind of took a bit of a pause based on some of those early lack of success. The other states in the West actually really didn't take a pause. In addition, in the early 2000s, Tony Clevenger up in Banff released his first monitoring report that really demonstrated that when constructed successfully, these wildlife crossing structures and this type of mitigation really did work. Probably more relevant for Colorado was some of the stuff done in other Western states that were actually not quite the scale of what was done in Banff. Norris Dodd's group down in Arizona released the results of some monitoring of crossing structures down there that showed them to be very successful. Patty Kramer in Utah did the same thing with her group. Pat Bastings, who you'll hear from later today, also did some stuff in Montana that was proven to be very successful. So there was essentially this body of scientific literature that was beginning to be established that really showed that these crossing structures could be effective. So that was one factor. The other was in 2014, CPW released its Western Slope Mule Deer strategy. And that was really an effort by CPW to reverse what was a pretty significant decline in the statewide mule deer population between 2006 and 2013. That mule deer strategy was a facilitated statewide effort amongst a bunch of stakeholders to really look at factors limiting mule deer populations. And the result of that strategy was the identification of 7 strategic priorities, one of them being reducing the impacts of highways on mule deer migration and survival. And importantly, really with the finalization of that West Slope mule deer strategy, the Wildlife Commission and CPW managers freed up some funding to implement those strategic priorities that were identified, including working with CDOT to try and implement something related to mitigating the impact of highways. And as importantly, it wasn't just funding, it was freeing up staff time to work with CDOT. And so if I had to pick a year that really sort of was the beginning of sustained collaboration between CPW and CDOT in the manner that we see it today, I would probably pick 2015, right after the West Slope mule deer strategy was completed. CPW reached out to CDOT on the southwest and the northwest regions of the state, and really we began to sit down and have regular meetings to try and come up with a broader plan of how to deal with migration issues and habitat connectivity and wildlife vehicle collisions. Up to this point, it had really been kind of on a project by project basis that the agencies coordinated, but this was really the first time that we started thinking, how do we plan and in a proactive way to kind of get ahead of the curve. And then in 2016, kind of in response to this increased coordination, CDOT staff were able to obtain research grant funds to do the West Slope Wildlife Prioritization Study that we're going to talk about today. CDOT, of course, called for a joint study panel comprised of both CDOT and CPW staff to oversee the consultant team on that West Slope study. And both agencies did assign staff to work on it. CPW also agreed to contribute some of their mule deer strategy implementation funds to the West Slope study. And we eventually worked out a data sharing agreement. So for the West Slope study, in the past, when we were looking at on a project by project basis, implementing mitigation and for wildlife vehicle collisions, really we just looked primarily at CDOT's roadkill data and State Patrol roadkill data. Well, this was the first time that we took CPW's data as well, our VHF collar data and our GPS collar data. I looked at migration patterns and really tried to combine the two into the study that our folks are going to talk about today. And so one of the real beneficial things that came out of the West Slope study, even prior to its completion in 2017, was that the agency folks who were working on the study panel for that West Slope study really, it became very apparent that we needed to expand the effort statewide and really expand it beyond just mule deer. And so the agency champions that were part of that study panel essentially pushed forward with the consultant team, the 2017 Wildlife Summit that pulled together decision makers and stakeholders to try and highlight how significant the problem was across Colorado, and also to try and come up with some ideas for solutions. And so a work plan kind of resulted from that Wildlife Summit in 2017. And then the Transportation Alliance was formed to try and implement that work plan. And since the formation of the Transportation Alliance, we have in fact pushed forward several projects that were identified as priorities in the West Slope Wildlife Prioritization Study. In addition to that, you'll hear today that we are moving forward to try and expand with an East Slope Prioritization Study to essentially replicate what was done on the West Slope on the East Slope. And so really the West Slope Prioritization Study did a lot to bring both agencies together in the collaborative way that they are working today. And so with that, I will turn it over to Julia Kinch, and she will give you some of the detail and the nuts and bolts on the West Slope Prioritization Study.
Good morning, everybody, and happy Earth Day also. Thanks, John, for that background and history. I'm Julia Kinch, principal and senior ecologist with Eco Resolutions, based in Golden, Colorado. And as John mentioned, it really took all these efforts that he was describing that ultimately led up to the Western Slope Wildlife Prioritization Study. And CDOT and CPW seeing this need for a more proactive approach to pursuing mitigation projects. So the Western Slope study was initiated in 2017, and the study was led by myself and Pat Jacobs with Jacob. I'm sorry, Pat Basting with Jacobs. And I'm going to kick off this presentation with some of the background on the project, and then I will dive into the prioritization process itself. And then I'm going to turn it over to Pat, and he's going to talk about the decision support framework, and in particular, the benefit cost analysis tool that was a part of this study. And he will also talk about those efforts to expand the study over to the Eastern Slope and Plains. The research really derived out of that recognition of the costs of wildlife vehicle collisions in Colorado, which amount to over $66 million annually. And then, as John mentioned, seeing how well these mitigation projects, to some extent in Colorado, but mostly in these other states, were achieving success in reducing wildlife collisions and maintaining and restoring wildlife permeability. So that success that was observed, we wanted to join in on that and replicate that here. And then Colorado's Western Slope is home to several of the largest migratory herds of mule deer and elk in North America. And so not surprisingly, we see that over 60% of wildlife vehicle collision accidents that are reported to law enforcement occur on the Western Slope. And CDOT environmental managers on the Western Slope were interested in developing then a more strategic and landscape scale approach to determining how to invest mitigation dollars rather than doing it on that project by project basis. So specifically what CDOT was looking for was a prioritized list and map of highway segments that demonstrate where mitigation would have the greatest impact on reducing wildlife vehicle collisions and providing connectivity for deer and elk as well as other wildlife. So as described by John, CDOT and CPW really joined forces in this research effort. It was a 2-year study that was funded by both of the agencies and conducted by Jacobs Engineering, Eco Resolutions, and Conservation Science Partners. So, of course, both agencies have their missions as state agencies, as representing transportation and wildlife. The primary goal for CDOT in embarking on this was to provide safer roads for the traveling public while minimizing those impacts of the transportation network on wildlife. For CPW, the primary objective was to ensure that long-term health of these wildlife populations that they're responsible for managing and reducing the impacts of wildlife collisions on our herds. And as John described, this really aligned with the mule deer strategy to increase herd sizes across the western slope. So for our study, we were directed to conduct an analysis of mule deer and elk movement patterns relative to our state highway network across the western slope and identify and prioritize these wildlife highway conflict areas under both current and future land use and traffic volume scenarios. And then this analysis would then be used to inform how and where mitigation will have that impact on reducing those collisions and maintaining healthy populations, as well as being able to integrate these mitigation priorities into transportation planning and project development. Our approach involved creating wildlife vehicle collision risk models based on mule deer and elk collar data, and using what we know about how these collared animals are moving across the landscape and where they're crossing roads to extrapolate across the entire western slope. So to do this, we use the collar data to create Brownian bridge movement models, which those are a way of translating these discrete collar point locations into a continuous probabilistic utilization distribution. But we quickly encountered some problems with this approach. So we had an abundance of data for both of these target species. We were looking at over 500 collared mule deer and nearly 300 collared elk, and many thousands of points associated with all of these animals. But what we found was that our movement models were just uninformative. And this was due to a variety of things. First is that the movement collar data that we have derives from demographic studies of ungulate populations. And so the point locations are not really frequent enough to accurately capture how ungulates move across the landscape. And then our target species that we're working with, mule deer and elk, they're both habitat generalists. So making those associations between where the collar points are and a habitat association was just too generalized to be useful. And then you layer on top of that, that the western slope is blessed with extensive high quality habitat. And that's why we see those really large herds in this area. We don't see the narrow migration corridors that are observed in other areas. Instead, we have shorter distance movements between winter and summer range. And with these large herds, that winter and summer range can actually overlap for different portions of the herd. Then, in addition, because the collars were put out for these demographic studies, CPW was intentionally collaring animals far away from major highways. And that meant that there's actually little interaction between our collared and individuals and the roadways that we're looking at. So we found out that we weren't ultimately able to use the collar data for this study as planned, and that does suggest that there's a real need for more movement-oriented collar studies in Colorado. But while we couldn't extrapolate for the purpose of building these models, we were still able to use the Brownian bridge movement models in the areas of the herds that they represent to inform species use of the landscape at a finer scale. And so including those data in each of our priority highway segment maps. So we had to come up with a different approach for both addressing the safety hazard of wildlife vehicle collisions and capturing that need for wildlife to move across roadways. We went back to the drawing board and we ended up developing this suite of complementary input criteria based on the best available data for these purposes. So that included a revised wildlife vehicle collision risk model based on wildlife vehicle collision data. And I'm going to explain more about that in a second here. But we still wanted to capture these areas with greatest need for wildlife movement, regardless of whether or not we've been seeing collisions happen in those areas. So we brought in these additional criteria to round out the wildlife values, and that included things like the magnitude of mule deer and elk migration movements. So really capturing the number of animals that are using a given migration route or winter range, the impacts of wildlife vehicle collisions on a particular population. And then we also looked at the connectivity value for other species in addition to mule deer and elk. And in our case on the Western Slope, what we focused on was Canada lynx. And then finally, we capture the safety component with CDOT traffic and safety. They create a wild animal accident pattern recognition layer that is conducted by road type. And that's the process that CDOT uses to identify all kinds of safety issues. So like I said, let's take a quick dive into those, our alternate wildlife vehicle collision risk models. These are regression-based models that relate the roadway and the surrounding environmental characteristics of recorded wildlife vehicle collisions with random locations, so that then we can predict where on the roadway wildlife vehicle collisions are most likely to occur. So they are models, they are imperfect, but they still are really useful for highlighting the drivers of risk. And we can also use them to project into those future conditions, those future land use and traffic volume scenarios to be able to estimate what future wildlife vehicle collision risk might look like across the landscape. And then these are also, the great advantage here was that they could readily be extrapolated across the Western Slope. So that was no problem. And what we found with the wildlife vehicle collision risk models is that they explain between 26 to 40% of the variability between those wildlife vehicle collision locations and random locations. And that overall, the strongest drivers of risk were tree cover, traffic volume, speed, and changes in speed limit. We did see variation among the two species and by season, so either in winter range or during a migration period. And then overall, we found that the patterns of future risk are actually very similar to current risk. And that's really helpful to know because that gives us confidence that the mitigation that we're implementing now will also retain its functionality into the future. So here's what all those data layers look like, these inputs. This example is for mule deer. So we have the 4 different wildlife vehicle risk models for both capturing migration and winter range and under current and future scenarios, the magnitude of winter range use, magnitude of migration movement, the wildlife vehicle collision impacts on the herd, and then the traffic and safety wildlife vehicle collision patterns by road type. So we took all those input criteria and we weighted each one of those inputs. For each half-mile segment, then we could take those weighted scores across all of the prioritization criteria to come up with a final prioritization score for that half-mile segment. So what you can see here is that the weighted wildlife vehicle collision risk under current conditions is weighted higher than future conditions because there's always more uncertainty than when we in the present time than when we project out into the future. The other wildlife criteria each received a weight of 3, recognizing that these all capture different aspects of the value to wildlife. And then the other connectivity value for other wildlife species. So again, Canada lynx. Then that just really provides a small additive value when that overlaps with other priority areas. And so there are these multiple input layers that capture all of the wildlife related aspects of the prioritization. And then we just have this one layer that captures the safety benefits. And that really reflects the high confidence that CDOT has in this data layer. We gave it a weight of 10 in the overall prioritization. So combine all of these criteria, again, we tally them up and they capture that intent of our research study panel to create a prioritization that is largely influenced by wildlife vehicle collision safety needs, but also is considering those wildlife movement needs during winter and migration seasons. So here's what that map looks like of the final prioritization. The areas that are red are in the 90th percentile, and these are really the areas where we're going to focus our efforts. Orange segments are in the 80th to 90th percentile, and so on. And so we did conduct the analysis for the entire western slope, but because transportation projects are prioritized and implemented by region, we separated the results out and the rankings out by region. So that's what this looks like. These maps show the top 5% in each region. So CDOT Region 3 is in the northwest corner of the state, and CDOT Region 5 captures the southwest region. And again, these regional results are really helpful for prioritizing regional projects, because that's how project work priorities originate. It's a process that comes up from the regions to the state level. Then for each of these top 5% segments, Pat and I went out in the field and we began looking at opportunities and challenges to mitigation in each of these areas. So we first started out by looking at where existing infrastructure could potentially be improved or retrofit for wildlife. And then we identified new crossing structure opportunities, and where crossing structures weren't feasible, then we had to start looking for other types of mitigation strategies that could be implemented in those areas. So it's important to remember that these are really preliminary mitigation recommendations, and they offer a really good starting point for mitigation project planning and budgeting, but it's just a first cut look. These have to get refined and revised substantially through the project design process. So this is one of those slides that you can't read very well. This is our implementation considerations matrix. So basically, we wanted the primary prioritization to be based on wildlife and safety values. But even when you narrow that down to the top 5% in each region, that's still a lot of highway. And ultimately, you know, we all know that there are a number of other variables that influence which projects get built first. So that's why we created this matrix, to help capture this other information about what we were calling secondary implementation criteria. So each of the rows represents one of those high priority segments. And then for each of these segments, we wanted to take a high level look at where there might be some opportunity to advance individual projects. And so one question we asked is there already a project that might be partially in progress? What's the status of that? Is there an EA or an EIS that identifies and commits the agency to wildlife mitigation? Has wildlife mitigation been identified for a project either in the short-term transportation plan or in the longer-term 10-year development plan? Maybe does this segment overlap with a priority herd that's been identified through Secretarial Order 3362, and that might lend it as a potential funding opportunity for that project area? Are there maybe opportunities to improve existing infrastructure instead of having to build more costly new crossing structures? And are wildlife crossings even feasible in this segment, or are there other variables and factors that might hinder the construction of wildlife crossing structures? And definitely, are there other potential partners who can help to bring mitigation funding to the table or help secure that larger corridor for wildlife movement? And then finally, we looked at whether there is a energy development corridor that might present either a threat to wildlife movement in that area or maybe an opportunity to partner. So you can see that this is, again, a very high level look at all of these questions. It doesn't give us all the detail, but it does tell us where to look more deeply. And it's a dynamic spreadsheet. We can track projects as they progress on this spreadsheet and highlight you know, where we might want to be looking for opportunities to follow up on these areas. So here is a link to the study report and the benefit cost analysis tool on CDOT's research website. And Tabor, if you could please, maybe you could copy this link into the chat, and or I can do it later. It is a hefty report. It's pretty big, but once a user understands the methods and the output of the prioritization process, the report is really designed as a reference with each section hyperlinked so you can easily jump around to the areas that you need. A lot of the report is composed of those preliminary mitigation recommendations for each of those priority segments. So you can just jump to the segment of interest and ignore all the rest for the time being. You'll also find links to describing the benefit cost analysis tool and the wildlife valuation process that Pat's going to be discussing. And we just encourage you to download this and explore its contents. You don't necessarily need it to read it cover to cover, and that's not really the intent either. So that is all I was going to present here today, and I'm going to pass it over to Pat to talk about the decision support framework and the benefit cost analysis tool.
Thank you, Julia. Okay, you want to move to the next slide. My name is Pat Basting, and as Julia indicated, I work with Jacobs Engineering for the past 6 years here in Colorado. Prior to that, I was a district biologist with the Montana Department of Transportation for 19 years, spending the majority of that time working in Western Montana, where I had the opportunity to work with a large group of folks, both within MDT and outside of MDT, from citizens to tribes to state and federal agency folks, to help get, by the time we left, we had over 80 wildlife crossings, from small mammals to large type structures throughout Western Montana. And since that time working in Colorado, I've had the absolute privilege of working with folks like John at CPW and a host of other CPW staff on the Western Slope study, as well as Tony Cady and others within CDOT who have just absolutely been tremendous, helping to get this going and picking it up and running with it. And also the privilege of working with Julia on this stuff. It's been a lot of fun, so I really appreciate it. So what I'm going to dive into a little bit here is, as Julia said, really the Western Slope study is a decision support tool to aid CDOT in transportation planning as well as project development. And specifically in regards to wildlife mitigation, they can go to the report and find, okay, for our respective region, where are the highest priority areas that I might need to focus on to get mitigation done? And so they can go to the report and get the maps. And then what kind of mitigation? And as Julia said, the preliminary recommendations in here are the starting talking point, in which they can engage with engineers and CPW staff and others to begin the development of the mitigation within a project. In addition, the benefit cost analysis tool that was created, which I'll be going into a little more later, allows CDOT to play with different scenarios on different types, sizes of structures, lengths of fencing, number of jump outs, wildlife guards, that kind of stuff, to see where they can get with regards to meeting project budgets and benefit cost ratios. Then again, is the implementation matrix that Julia just went over. It helps CDOT refine which priorities might be most feasible in near, midterm, and long term with regards to a whole suite of different questions that can be answered and dealt with. And they're kind of outlined here with the bullet points. And finally, the benefit cost analysis tool was also a useful tool in terms of helping them identify potential sources of funding within CDOT and also for external grant purposes. Next. Okay, so with respects to the Western Slope study, the benefit cost analysis was a systematic process for identifying, quantifying, comparing expected benefits versus the costs of potential wildlife mitigation incorporated into an infrastructure project. And for our purposes here, we specifically were just looking at wildlife mitigation if it were integrated into a project. CDOT already has mechanisms for doing benefit cost analysis for roads and road projects, but nothing was available to look at the BCA relative to incorporating wildlife mitigation. And so that was the intent and the purpose. And so this working on this study, it really allowed our study team to work with CDOT and CPW, both agencies providing input, to develop a trusted and useful tool that both agencies were familiar with. Next. So I'd like to use the chat tool for you folks to weigh in. And one of the first questions would be, how many of you have had the opportunity to do a benefit cost analysis for a wildlife mitigation project you've been working on? Feel free to weigh in as I roll through the presentation. The second question, the follow-up was, well, how many of you have been told that incorporating wildlife mitigation into a project didn't benefit costs out, but we're kind of left wondering why? Well, hopefully we can get to some answers to that to help you understand a little more as we roll through this process. I'm not going to go through all these key terms, but we're putting them up there for you as something that you should reference and become familiar with as you work on benefit cost analysis. And thus the webinar will be available for you to download. Next. Okay, so as a quick overview, the benefit cost analysis for the wildlife mitigation, what it's going to do is it allows us to include all the wildlife mitigation components and evaluate them on a benefit cost analysis. And it also includes the value for wildlife that were killed in wildlife vehicle collisions over a 10-year period for a segment of roadway that we're going to be working on. Also, in some formulas, it allows us to include a residual value for this large structures. As large underpasses, bridges, or an overpass, the engineering design life for those structures is typically 75 years or more. And you got to understand that most benefit cost analysis that are done, depending on for what entity, are either 20 or 30 years. So those structures could be out there on the landscape performing for an additional 45 years. So residual value, wrapping that in, allows you to account for that and bringing it into the benefit cost analysis. Finally, the tool, as you'll see real quickly, calculates a benefit cost ratio in 3 ways in order to support potential funding sources relative to state highway and safety programs, federal highway safety programs, and federal grant opportunities or potential bond funding. And so this automated Excel worksheet tool is quick, it's pretty easy, it's really not that complicated, but that's largely due to the collaboration that we had from CDOT project economists in the planning division and the traffic and safety unit personnel that was working with us on this. Working with them, we were able to get this integrated and built to work really well. So hats off to them for the work they did on that. So what we talked about earlier was integration of wildlife value. So one of the first questions that comes up is, well, what did you use? And so one of the first questions our study team with CDOT and CPW staff was, well, what do we have to work with? And one of the first things that comes up and has commonly come up and other states have used as well is what's put in state statute regarding wildlife value for illegal poaching of an animal. And so in Colorado, the values are 500 for deer and 700 for elk. we then looked at, well, what's available in the transportation ecology research literature and what's been done. And many of you may be familiar with the paper that Marcel Huser and his co-authors put together a paper and published it in 2009. It calculated the cost of wildlife vehicle collisions to society on a per incident basis for deer, elk, and moose. And within that, if you break it down, there is a value for wildlife. But as it turned out, that value for wildlife was actually lower than the state statute. And so our study panel members from CDOT and CPW felt, you know, given the economic value of wildlife to Colorado and its contribution to our economy, let's take another look and see if there's a way that we can find a representative value that is defensible. And so our team moved forward with that. Next. And working again with CDOT's economist, Dr. Ruana Ford, we ended up coming to an acceptance and recognition. We're going to use the contingent valuation method, which is based on a survey-based analysis and society's willingness to pay. And so one of the things that we did was focused on our data sources and tried to minimize the number of data sources we used, but also could cite reputable data sources. And so the two primary data sources we use, one was Fish and Wildlife Service does their, well, periodically, the 3 to 5 years, they do the national surveys for hunting and fishing and wildlife recreation and generate values for society's willingness to pay for some different activities. And so that was one of our primary sources. And the other obviously was Colorado Parks and Wildlife and their number of licenses sold and the fees for those licenses. So eventually what comes out for the wildlife valuation is willingness to pay for the opportunity to hunt a deer or an elk, the weighted average fee value for in-state and out-of-state residents, and the opportunity to pay. They paid for their antlerless and either sex licenses sold, and all prices were adjusted to 2018. And then the average expenditures was based on non-resident hunters, again, derived from the Fish and Wildlife Survey. And the reason we only could use non-resident hunters was because it's assumed that in-state residents would spend their money within the state of Colorado, and therefore it would not be new money to the economy, whereas non-resident hunters are bringing new money to the economy. So when you add these three things up, and we had this back checked with other a couple of different natural resource economists, we came up with the next slide. The values for deer came out to be $2,061, and for elk, $2,392. And again, these are adjusted to 2018 dollars. So when we start working in the benefit cost analysis, if we go to the next slide, this is a quick snapshot of the spreadsheet and the data input. And so essentially it's very quick. You identify your highway segment, your beginning and ending mileposts. You can then add in your mitigation items such as wildlife guards, fencing, jump outs or escape ramps, as other people call them, and then your structures or your underpasses or overpasses. And so you enter the information in your mitigation item. And the spreadsheet, we've used data from CDOT construction to generate costs per item and lifespan per item. And so the spreadsheet automatically fills this stuff out once you add in your mitigation item. And it generates your mitigation costs. It includes contingency multipliers and construction engineering and indirect charges that CDOT uses, as well as the maintenance costs. And so then we come into, okay, what's our construction year going to be? And then the second bullet there is, okay, is this going to take 1 or 2 years to build? As far as the crash reduction factors, there's a third tab in the spreadsheet that identifies all the studies that we used and cited to generate our crash reduction factors. And so for wildlife crossing structures with longer sections of continuous fencing, based on what we were looking at, we came up with an average of about 83% crash reduction factor based on published studies and research. And the other option is, well, if you have an isolated crossing structure with short sections of wing fencing. And so there's another value that you can click on if you're in that type of situation. And I think that value comes out to around 52%. So anyhow, you have the option to choose what type of mitigation you're working in that regard for a crash reduction factor. Now, before I move off the crash reduction factors, I do want to say that for traffic and safety, Federal Highways maintains a national database of crash reduction factors. But unfortunately, they don't really have anything relative to wildlife vehicle mitigation crash reductions. And so each state ends up having to do their own research to figure out what to apply. And so this is something that is kind of a call out to everybody in the country, is that we need to work with Federal Highways to help them build a reliable database so that everybody can start using a national database to potentially get to this, or at least be a good starting point to build from. But now moving on with the spreadsheet, we get to the crash history.
Sorry.
Oop, wait a minute, go back up. Preview, okay. For crash history, again, we use a 10-year time frame, and we look at reported accidents and whether we have fatalities, injuries, or property damage. And so you enter your number of accidents over that 10-year period, and the number of deer killed, and the number of elk. And this is where the wildlife valuation comes into play in the formulas. Okay, next slide. So by the time you scroll down in the spreadsheet, it will have already calculated your benefit cost ratio in 3 different ways. The first way is traffic and safety analysis and the formula that traffic and safety in CDOT uses. And this is specific to the Highway Safety Improvement Program and implementation of that. And it requires that in order to even qualify for potential funding under the Highway Safety Improvement Program, you have to have a benefit cost ratio of 1 or higher. And so also, at least in Colorado, there's a statewide safety program called FASTER. However, under that statewide program, if you have a benefit cost ratio of 0.25 or higher, you could potentially qualify for the state safety funds. So here you can see, just by looking at this quick benefit cost ratio of an actual project that was built by CDOT, what we could tell right off the bat was we weren't going to qualify, most likely weren't going to qualify for HSIP funds because the benefit cost ratio is less than 1. However, it might qualify for state FASTER funds. The second method, which is called the Division of Transportation Development, which is the planning department within CDOT. They use the federal formula for federal grants, used to be TIGER, then became build grants, potentially also for bond funding. And under the federal formula, it's very different than traffic and safeties. Traffic and safeties formula is really the valuations for fatalities, injuries, and property damage accidents are based more on actual costs and are kind of determined, I think, individually by each state. There is no national standard. So each state determines their values. The other thing is that traffic and safety formula is pretty set. It does not allow, it's not additive, so there's really no way to add in wildlife value or residual value. The other thing is the traffic and safety formula, because they're usually smaller projects, that BCA analysis is for 20 years. So when you get into the federal formula, that's actually based on society's willingness to pay to avoid that accident in the first place. And so the valuations for fatalities, injuries, and property damage are very different than what traffic and safety might use in their formula. And you can see that right there on the screen. The other thing is the timeline for the benefit cost analysis under the federal formula is 30 years versus 20. The other benefit with the federal formula is because it's contingency valuation based and survey based and willingness to pay to avoid the accident, it's additive. So under the US DOT guidelines, you do have the ability to add wildlife value into this formula, as well as their own guidance from US DOT to add in residual value for some of these larger structures. So under the DOT formula, the benefit cost ratio on this particular project actually came out at 0.73, which again was less than 1. So at least that told the folks that, hey, we may not qualify for a federal grant. So at this particular case, we may not proceed with trying to do a grant opportunity to get that funding. The third and final method was kind of a hybrid between the traffic and safety and the federal formula. It is based on the federal formula, but CDOT asked us to integrate traffic and safety values for fatalities, injuries, and property damage accidents. And because it's the federal formula, it allows us to incorporate the wildlife valuations as well as the residual value. And the reason they asked us to do this was a lot of the district administrators and the engineering folks within CDOT are familiar and comfortable with traffic and safety and evaluations that they have to work with, and they're familiar with them. And they thought, well, if we integrate that information into this and come up with a benefit cost ratio, that was something that they're familiar with, but it also allows us to add in the wildlife and the residual value. It's a very defensible formula based on information they're familiar with, but it's also a credible formula that's already in use. And what it would allow is decision makers to potentially have a decision tool on whether to base use of discretionary funds to help get a mitigation project. So that was kind of the purpose and background behind this hybrid approach. And so you'll see in this case, the benefit cost ratio came out to 1.43, something like that. So in a nutshell, it says that we might have some discretionary funding available. So moving on. So as I said, the output calculates your benefit cost ratio in 3 ways. Moving on. And behind the scenes, CDOT provided the unit costs and service life that we worked with them to develop, as well as mitigation effectiveness. There's another tab that shows where those factors were derived from. and then it integrates wildlife value and residual value. And there's an opportunity in this spreadsheet where you can check a box and it'll expand and open up, and you can look at all the details of your BCA analysis as far as the formulas. Next. So in summary, the Western Slope Study provides a data-driven priority areas for CDOT regions to focus where to invest wildlife collision mitigation. And it allows for the early strategic planning and funding opportunities to be identified and brought forward during project development over a longer planning horizon versus the prior method, as was indicated previously, of trying to do this stuff project by project. And so there you can see the benefits and the values and the bullet points with regards to the benefit cost analysis. And I'll leave those up for you to read. And that wraps up my portion of it, I think, except we then took this study and are integrating it into the Eastern Slope and Plains prioritization study. And so this has been an effective mechanism where we generated a lot of excitement and backing as a result of the Western Slope study. And we're rolling it out to the rest of the state for the Eastern Slope and the Plains, adapting the methodologies that we've developed for this from the Western Slope and applying them to this new study area. Some areas out in the Plains, we have some different target species and geographic considerations that we're looking at relative to movement patterns. And we'll be updating and refining the decision support tools to be appropriate for the Eastern Slope and Plains. And so ultimately, at the end, when we get done, we'll have a statewide prioritization completed for the entire state of Colorado for CDOT and CPW to work with together and move forward on. Thank you.
Thanks, Pat. So we'll move on with Tony Katie on implementation.
All right, thanks. Yeah, so again, my name is Tony Katie. I work as the Planning and Environmental Manager for CDOT Region 5, which is in the southwest part of the state. And I'm going to go over how our department is integrating the West Slope Wildlife Prioritization Study into our project selection and planning processes. I'm going to turn my camera off. I've got some bandwidth issues and then roll into the presentation. All right, so, really to explain how we integrate the study into our planning process, I kind of need to provide some high-level background on how transportation planning happens within Colorado. This simple graphic shows the cyclical nature of our 4-year transportation planning cycle. And at the very beginning of this process, we, as a state, take a look at how much revenue we expect to get over the next 20 to 25 years. And then with that assumption, we start to plan accordingly. So once the revenues are projected, our executive management needs to determine how much of this revenue needs to be allocated to the maintenance of our existing assets to comply with federal performance standards. So a simple example of this is a determination of what percentage of our existing statewide budget needs to go to funding our highway paving program to keep our roads in a drivable condition. How much needs to go towards bridge maintenance and repairs to keep those assets from degrading and becoming safety issues, things like that. And just for your information, about 80% of all CDOT funds goes to just simply maintaining our existing assets like our pavement, our bridges, and our culverts. But in addition to that, a determination is made at this step as to how much funding will go towards safety improvement projects across the state to address our priority safety improvement needs. And then there's an allocation of a very small pot of discretionary funding that goes to each region. So once a determination is made as to how much money will be allocated to each of our different program areas, we then start multiple rounds of meetings with our planning partners to develop a list of transportation needs. This includes a significant amount of public outreach, numerous meetings with our city and county elected officials, and then meetings with an elected board of transportation planning region members. At the end of this public outreach process, each transportation planning region across the state helps the department to develop a fiscally constrained list of projects that really does best meet the needs, transportation needs identified both internally within CDOT, and those are the asset projects like our paving and our bridges that I mentioned, and then externally with our stakeholders on projects like transit or bike and ped projects. We do talk about some safety projects, but we really focus on the utilization of those small pots of discretionary funding for regional priorities. The fiscally constrained list of projects is then made into a 4-year statewide transportation improvement plan, which was mentioned before. And that document really just outlines how and when we'll build projects to address the issues that were identified during this planning process. Okay, so I mentioned that the planning cycle occurs once every 4 years, and it looks out 25 years for this really long range vision of how the department will meet the transportation needs across the state. So historically, this effort has allowed us to derive 2 plans, a 25-year long range transportation plan, which really outlines the identification of the needs on our priority corridors across the state and probable solutions to addressing those needs. So, really critical to have wildlife vehicle collision reduction identified as a need on a corridor at this stage in the game. We're also able to develop a fiscally constrained 4-year short-term implementation plan. But recognizing the incongruity of these 2 planning timeframes, we've also developed a 10-year strategic project list or a project pipeline that we use to identify projects outside of current funding pools that we will build if additional funding becomes available. I wanted to mention that, within my region of the state, Region 5, we've really recognized the need to drive our decision-making process through the application of analytics. Asset projects like paving and bridge projects are selected by analyzing data on that asset condition, and then we work to address those assets in the most need of maintenance first. To determine improvement needs and priorities for safety projects or the need for additional passing lanes, the need for additional shoulders or intersection improvements or other regional priorities, we've historically utilized studies that analyze data metrics to help us in our work with our planning stakeholders to identify those projects that will have the greatest benefit to our system and its users. And it really wasn't until the publication of the West Slope Wildlife Prioritization Study that we had a document that would help us strategically and proactively select and prioritize projects that would allow us to address wildlife vehicle collisions. And this was a big hole in our planning program because, as Julia mentioned, wildlife vehicle collisions can be some of the biggest safety issues on many stretches of our highways in the western part of the state. Okay, so this slide is just really meant to illustrate the sheer volume of the needs that are identified by our planning partners during the planning cycle that I talked about. And really to illustrate how competitive it is to get a safety project prioritized in that 4-year or 10-year timeframe. So these are the project needs that were identified by just the Southwest TPR, and it's only one of 15 TPRs across the state. The list was so extensive that I had to cut it into 6 screenshots just to fully show the generated list during our planning process. So I'll run through those really quick. So, this list is comprised of a huge mix of projects, safety projects, capacity improvement projects, bike and ped facilities, basically anything that falls outside of a traditional asset-driven program within the department. And it's really those projects that get selected and then prioritized for funding in both the 4-year STIP and that 10-year strategic pipeline of projects. And they're all competing for that, that 20% of the budget that's still left over after we've worked to maintain our assets. During this last round of transportation planning within Region 5, and I know within Region 3 it is very similar, we presented the outcomes of the West Slope Wildlife Prioritization Study and then really impressed upon the groups that were delivering that message to the importance of this data. So we presented it to the 3 TPRs that are within Region 5 service area. And then I also presented the study to each of the counties within our 15 county service area as well. Further, our transportation planner in Region 5 put each top 5% site that was identified in the West Slope Wildlife Prioritization Study as a project need on the list of projects that the TPRs were to help CDOT prioritize for funding in that 4-year window, and then within that 10-year strategic pipeline of projects. And this effort was very successful. It yielded very positive results for Region 5 and also for Region 3. So of our 3 TPRs, the Gunnison Valley TPR prioritized 2 West Slope top 5% sites in their project list of just 13 projects. The Southwest TPR identified 8 projects with wildlife mitigation components in their project list. And then the San Luis Valley identified 3 projects with wildlife mitigation and prioritized those projects for funding within those 2 planning documents that I've been talking about. And so that's just a really long way of saying that the West Slope Wildlife Prioritization Study has really allowed CDOT to change the identification of wildlife mitigation project needs from more of a reactive response, where wildlife vehicle collision reduction and habitat connectivity needs were being identified prior to project selection, or I'm sorry, after project selection, and after project budgets have been established. So at this phase in the project lifecycle, it changed it to more of a strategic and proactive identification of these needs at the inception of our project list, so that the scope elements are incorporated into the project development process from the very beginning. So at that plan integration and the needs identification stage in our planning cycle. And that allows us to incorporate those scope elements into a project and then assure that budget's been assigned for that specific scope item, which in this case, we're talking about wildlife vehicle collision mitigation measures. Outside of just Region 5 and Region 3, we've been highly successful in prioritizing projects that address wildlife issues. Our 10-year strategic project list, or our pipeline, has identified 25 individual projects with wildlife mitigation components that are going to be prioritized for funding. Numerous of those have already received distributions of new funding sources or are currently or will be built within the next several years. So really having this study has allowed us to prioritize those projects. And then as new funding has become available, we've been able to insert those into our project delivery stages. I wanted to point out a few other ways that we're utilizing the West Slope results into our daily efforts within the region. So the map application on the left is our planning map, and it shows all the projects that have been identified in our 4-year STIP, and then also within the 10-year project list. We've also included the data from the West Slope Wildlife Prioritization Study in this data set, so that when we're analyzing any new project proposals, we can determine if wildlife vehicle collision reduction needs have been identified and then should be incorporated into that project scope and budget. This is reviewed in Region 5 by our senior staff on a quarterly basis, and it really allows us to drive new project creation and the determination if a project could bundle different initiatives together so that we could achieve multiple objectives in one single construction effort. And then the map on the right is our environmental scoping tool. This allows all of CDOT's environmental and NEPA staff to determine what environmental resources need to be considered and addressed before a project can be approved and then move into that construction phase. The West Slope Wildlife Prioritization Study data has been uploaded to this tool so that our on-the-ground project staff can take a look at the data and determine if wildlife vehicle collision consideration should be addressed during that project scoping phase of the project. So, utilized in tandem, both tools really helps us to ensure that appropriate considerations are being made at both that planning and the project delivery levels. So last, I wanted to highlight just a few of the regional successes that the integration of the West Slope Wildlife Prioritization Study results into our planning efforts have really helped us facilitate. So the first is this US 24 wildlife fencing project. This was identified as a top 5% site, and we utilized the West Slope Wildlife Prioritization Study results to help drive a grant proposal. and then direct internal funding to this really important regional project. We hope to complete the installation of 4 miles of wildlife fencing tied to 8 large concrete box culverts or bridges that are currently existing in the system, and that will really serve effectively as wildlife crossing structures. So a very large benefit for a relatively small cost. This next project is the US 160 east of Fort Garland Safety Improvement Project. This project will install several miles of fencing and up to 2 wildlife crossing structures on US 160. The West Slope Wildlife Prioritization Study helped to prioritize this project with the San Luis Valley Transportation Planning Region for funding. And we're starting the design of this project. That'll occur over the next 2 years, and then we're going to construct this project in 2024. And then the last project I wanted to mention is the US 550 Billy Creek Wildlife Underpass project. We utilize the data within the West Slope study to prioritize this project with the Gunnison Valley TPR. And then we obtained funding through CDOT's Senate Bill 267 funding pool. The project is being designed right now and will be built in 2022 or 2023, whenever the plans are finalized and the right-of-way has been obtained. So, you know, that's just within a 2-year time frame, 3 projects within Region 5 that the West Slope study has really helped to prioritize and to get incorporated into our project delivery plans. So I know we're running a little long on time, so I'll wrap it up with that, and hopefully I can answer any questions that you guys might have during the Q&A that we'll have coming up next. So thanks for your time, and I'll turn it back over to Tabor.
Thanks, Tony. Well, great. That was really fun to learn about how all these pieces integrate together. And I see some comments from some participants as well that were excited to learn more about how all these pieces fit together. And we do have some questions. So Julia, if all the panelists wanted to turn on their video, we can go that way too, just to have all your faces. So Julia, there's a couple of questions for you. One, in terms of the study, how did you define future and what was the time frame analyzed?
Yes, so for the future modeling, we relied on how CDOT actually defines future, which is based on their 20-year plan. And as a part of their planning processes, they actually do create a future scenario model that's based on future land use changes and future traffic volumes. So we integrated that model into our wildlife vehicle collision risk modeling in order to look at those impacts on wildlife vehicle collision risk.
Great, thank you. Another question for you was, what's the process of getting a project included in the STIP?
I'm going to actually boot that over to Tony. He talked a lot about that on his presentation, and if you want to add something, why don't you take that, Tony?
Yeah, so hopefully I answered that question through my presentation, but really it's a combination of looking at that 25-year horizon and identifying all the needs in the corridor, and then determining through our models which assets need to be improved and how much money we need to dedicate to those improvements, and then focusing on the safety projects and then those regional priority projects that get funded with discretionary pools of funding, and then prioritizing those, and the ones that rise to the top and fall within the revenues that we're going to have within a 4-year time frame get placed into the STIP, and funding is then dedicated to those projects.
Thanks for that extra clarity there. So here's a long one. How can community concerns be included in a decision for any mitigation dollars? There are many non-quantifiable factors, which include time off work, stress from injuries, including minor issues, emotional responses. Data shows that 78% of everyone in a vehicle accident has some level of stress, including PTSD. These are significant inputs to decisions and can be driven by community response to each wildlife vehicle collision, measured through social media responses. So how do communities have a way to make meaningful comments that can be heard by CPW and CDOT? So I guess sort of just to reiterate those two questions, how can community concerns be included in the decision for any mitigation dollars? And then the second one is, what does that community input process look like? So maybe Tony, since you're representing CDOT on that, and then John, maybe with your prior experience with CPW, if Tony has, if CPW had any other processes, maybe you could go after Tony.
So I think the question is really focused on the evaluation tool, right? So is there a way that we can incorporate kind of these societal impacts from wildlife vehicle collisions? And I think it's tough because we have to show through data a quantifiable financial impact to show, you know, how much value we place on that when we're doing our benefit cost analysis. And so I think some of those issues are probably not concrete enough for us to define a distinct value for every one of those issues for every individual that has them. So I think it's going to be really hard for us to incorporate that into the hard data aspect of looking at valuation and then going after or prioritizing projects. But I do think on the planning side of things, you know, I mentioned that public process, and I mentioned meeting with our transportation planning regions and the city and counties. We invite the public to every single one of those meetings. And those are the opportunities that people have to come and express their concern about a need on a highway corridor, to maybe try to elevate the prioritization status of a designated wildlife vehicle collision mitigation structure based off of those perceived issues or those known issues. And then also, you know, I just would like to mention CDOT did one of the largest public outreach processes during the last statewide planning effort, where we had surveys and websites. We went out to farmers markets and Walmart parking lots, and we really tried to engage the public to understand what they believe the needs are on their transportation system. And I think those are the opportunities where the community can really engage with the DOT to identify those priorities, express their concerns over those issues, and then hopefully try to elevate those in our eyes, so that we're looking at, you know, outside of just the raw data, we're also looking at the perceived needs that the community has, and we're hopefully elevating those in our prioritization.
Yeah,
John,
Tony.
your other hat? Yeah, what do you think?
Yeah, thanks for that, Tony. It's, you know, I was going to basically add similarly, I think the local planning process is really the place for input. I mean, one of the things we didn't really talk about is that, you know, although this prioritization has taken place and it really shows us where, based on the factors we looked at, there needs to be mitigation, there are additional local factors and local planning, you know, that can have input into that process, you know, through the TPR process or through the local county planning process. You know, one of the things that the Transportation Alliance is struggling with right now is how to interact with local governments and counties to get some of these priorities sort of in their planning process. And so as local citizens, I mean, if you know of an area that's particularly bad for wildlife vehicle collisions, and it's not addressed at all in the county comprehensive plan or in some of the, you know, the more local plans, that is certainly a very good place to have input. Because, you know, as we have tried to push forward some of these mitigation projects, it's pretty apparent that we need to keep the lands adjacent to these wildlife crossings open for animals to use them, to maintain the functionality of the mitigation that's put into place. And from a CPW perspective, that goes beyond that to, you know, having lands protected, you know, to protect the entire migration corridor if it's migration area or winter range. And so there's a lot of areas for input, I think, in that sort of local planning process.
Really good point. Thanks, John.
Thanks. That's really helpful to also understand the different levels of state and local opportunities to get involved and share concerns from the community. So just a question for Julia or Pat. Just wondering, could you address the timeline for the Eastern Slope study? And then again, the opportunities to engage with that process.
Sure. And Julia, chime in too. So we are shooting to have the Eastern Slope prioritization study completed by the end of this year. It may go into early next year, but we're moving forward, and that's kind of a preliminary timeline. I think right now is the end of this year, beginning of next year.
Great. And do you see opportunities to engage with the process, or how can people get involved or learn more?
That's a good question. And I think as we are, working on this for CDOT and CPW, I would almost say that the best way to engage is to reach out to your local CDOT and CPW staff in the area of the state that you're interested in or working in, and talk with them about some areas of concern that you might have. We certainly can't speak for those agencies, but we are working to integrate data and move things forward. But I think we're trying to, as Tony alluded to earlier on, provide data-driven analysis to develop these priority areas. And then once they become developed, then go through and review these and kind of do a gut check. Are we hitting the right areas before the report ever gets finalized? So.
I'd just add really quickly, that was a great answer, Pat, but just feeding off of what John was saying earlier, I think the real time for communities to engage is going to be when following this report. So whatever you can do to be prepared and communicating with people about these issues and areas that you care about leading up to the publication of the report, I think that's when it's really going to align and come together.
Yeah, great point. And I'd like to know, when we looked at those top 5% sites within Region 5, those priorities are separated by tenths of a point, right? They're all major needs on our transportation system. They're all going to improve habitat connectivity, and they're going to reduce wildlife mortality. And so having public engagement in the selection of those top 5% sites is really going to help us determine, which one gets built first versus which one gets built fifth. And they're also close that the benefit is going to be there in that list of the top 5% sites. So having some other input after we've developed the list and we've prioritized things to help us make decisions on which projects we go for grants for, and having public support, having letters of support from community members and the counties and the cities and the areas that we're trying to build these projects in really goes a long way to help us secure federal grant funding through grant cycles that come up annually. And we're looking for the best project to put forward, and having that public support really helps us kind of refine the selection of our projects.
Thanks, Tony. John.
Tony, and I'll just add, that kind of goes to, what Julia presented, in terms of the other criteria that we consider. There is even though we have this prioritized list now, right, that, top 1%, top 5%, and like you say, it's really a spreadsheet that's, each project is separated by a fraction of a percentile. But, as the Transportation Alliance, when we're looking at that list and trying to have input into CDOT's planning, we recognize that there is an opportunity sort of cost as well. And so the way, and what Julia presented and kind of those other factors to consider, we're not necessarily going to take those projects like in that straight order. That's just how we prioritize them based on the factors that we looked at, or Julia and her team looked at for the West Slope study and what will happen on the East Slope study. If there is local interest or a local partner that comes to the table and really is pushing for a project that may be a slightly lower priority, and there's an opportunity to push that project forward, that can happen, and that will happen. That's part of how this whole process has been designed.
We will have our website, our updated website, the Alliance's website, coming out soon, and we do have a list of folks on this webinar. So we'll be sending that out, and there is a contact us section if you want to look at current projects we're working on and our resources. So please do contact us if you would like to have more information, or if you are interested in supporting the projects that we're moving forward with. You'll see a contact us link. So we'll be sending that out when it's released. And webinar number 3 is also coming up, where we'd love to actually be sharing some more tools and tactics, and we can hit on this community engagement element a little bit more in our next webinar too. That's an excellent point. We only have a couple more minutes here. So Tony, when you go to your legislature for funding, is that for additional funding, or would that be considered as part of the 20% of existing funding that is available for non-maintenance projects?
Yeah, I mean, it would be in addition to the current funding streams that we have and that we know about. So if we want to identify additional funding for a specific safety program or the regional priority program, which is our discretionary pot of funding, you know, we would have to approach them with the need, right? A case for the need for additional funding for a particular area that, you know, we've identified the funding that we need to just maintain our assets. We could use more funding in that program as well, right across the board. CDOT is dramatically underfunded. I think we've got over a 10-year period, we've got a $6 to $9 billion funding gap. So we've identified mechanisms for increasing the funding within the department. Senate Bill 267 is a great example of that. And our executive management team has done a really good job taking the needs across the state and then kind of prioritizing the way that we're spending that funding. So a certain pot of that Senate Bill 267 funding, which was legislature approved, is going specifically to just maintaining our pavement, because over the last 15 to 20 years, we've really failed in, just based off of lack of revenues, we've failed in the upkeep and maintenance of our pavement. But outside of that, they've identified a pot of money that goes really for strategic safety projects. And as we've kind of talked about throughout this entire webinar, wildlife vehicle collisions in the Western Slope are a significant safety issue. And so several of the projects that I mentioned in Region 5, and I know several of the projects in Region 3 are being funded with that Senate Bill 267 funds, because they've been identified as strategic and critical safety needs within those 2 regions.
Thanks, Tony. Okay, we have one last question, and I know we're over time, so thanks for those that are hanging on. One quick technical question. We will be sharing this whole webinar on our new website, so there will be a link to the presentation and this discussion. So we'll be sending that out. Second, the question is, was time that the Colorado State Patrol or other state agency efforts that's used to respond to wildlife vehicular collisions factored into the real cost of preventing this from happening? So looking at the time that Colorado State Patrol or other state agencies' effort is used, is that looked at with the cost?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at it, and then I think Pat and Julia can talk about it, because they got really into the weeds on exactly what was calculated in our benefit cost analysis development. But we do factor in impacts to our system, right? So if we have to shut down a roadway due to a collision, the towing costs and the medical expenses and response time for agency staff, there was an estimate on how much that impacts Colorado's economy. And so that was baked into the factors when we were looking at calculating the cost of a wildlife vehicle collision. I'm not sure how, I think these are somewhat national standards, and they've got, the US DOT has an entire team of folks who look at the impacts from different types of collisions. And we're able to pull from that data to utilize in the way that we're calculating our benefit cost analysis in the 3 ways that Pat talked about. But I'll turn it over to those 2, and maybe they can shed a little more light on it.
No, I think you addressed that pretty accurately. I mean, so CDOT traffic and safety, and most DOTs, the way they take their wildlife vehicle collision costs, and it's not just for wildlife vehicle collisions, it's any kind of accident. The way they assign a cost value to that usually comes from either the, I'm going to get the agency wrong, either AASHTO or USDOT, and they take those national standards and then they kind of apply them to their states. So most states take the national crash cost and do some adjusting just based on whatever state considerations they have. And so that Colorado does that in part to adjust down the very, very high cost of a fatality so that we're not chasing fatalities is kind of how it's considered. And so within those crash costs, some of the, it includes both the direct cost of an accident, so the cleanup costs, the towing and medical costs and things like that, but also indirect costs such as the lost productivity and wages and things like that. So I think to answer the question about state patrol time, that seems like that's included in there. I can't draw a direct line from A to B, but it seems like that's fairly well captured in those overall crash costs. I don't know if Pat, you want to add on to that at all?
No, that between what you and Tony have talked about, it pretty much sums it up. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay, well, thanks to our panelists today. Thanks for all our participants, and a huge thanks to the Pew Charitable Trust for sponsoring this webinar. We will reach out with further information on our website and tune in to what we're doing. Lots of good stuff coming up. So thanks again for participating, and see y'all soon.
Thanks, Tabor.
Thanks, Tabor.
My pleasure.